finishing Buddhism. That's nothing more to be said.
Finishing Buddhism?
Yeah.
Interesting way of putting it.
I have a question about Buddhism.
Sure.
Do women have to be reincarnated as men to go to Nirvana? Or just like in
It depends what kind of Buddhist you are. No, in general, no.
In general, no. Okay.
Yeah.
But some Buddhists.
For the Jains, yes.
Yeah, the Jains, yes, but the Buddhists are different.
No, the Buddhists are pretty egalitarian. They're not sexist and they're not caste conscious. In general, people are people.
Okay. And in Hindu, it's the same thing. You don't have to. They don't have
That's
to be.
right. No.
It's just the Jains.
Yes. So,
Okay.
good girls go to heaven.
Yeah. I don't have to correct. Reincarnated.
No, I know people who say that. I'm going to come back as a man. That's what my sister says.
What?
That's the only way to live, especially when a man is winning.
A lot of jokes about reincarnation.
Yeah.
One guy tells his friend, I show up and I'll come back as a jackass. And the other guy says, oh, they don't give you the same role 2 times in a row.
Because they play the life of luxury, you know.
There is a little story in the Arthasashta, I think, about reincarnation that's it's winsome and it also brings out the idea very nicely. But it also shows the kind of strain of humor that runs through a lot of Indian religion, Hindu and Buddhism. This is the account of a Brahmin priest who went in with a rope and put it around the neck of a goat and led the goat to the temple of Kali, where the goat was to be sacrificed to the goddess Kali. And it reminds you a little bit about Balaam and the donkey too. When he got there and he took the goat and put it up on the altar and strapped it down. And the goat turned to him and said, excuse me. And he realized that God must be involved here. He was actually speaking to him. He said, yes. He said, I just thought there's something I might mention to you before you continue your duty. He said, what was that? He said, well, you know about reincarnation. Of course I know about reincarnation. Well, in my former life, I was a Buddhist priest who sacrificed a goat.
What goes around comes around, huh?
So, on to the show.
Okay, quiet on the set.
I think we were talking last time about Ashoka and the Buddhist empire, which covered all of India. And it was a very good empire, as empires go. Ashoka was an incredibly enlightened political leader, and his successors continued his policies, not quite as totally, but not quite totally, but to a considerable degree. But it ended in 185. The last of the Ashoka dynasty ended then. And I thought it might be a good idea to kind of see what happens to India subsequently.
And we're still talking BC with years, huh?
You are still there. Right. So the Mauryan Empire. Which had begun as a Hindu empire, and then Ashoka, an Indian emperor, a Hindu emperor, was converted to Buddhism and became a Buddhist empire. And it went down to 185 BCE. And then there was total fragmentation, not immediately, but gradually. The empire fell apart. And from then on, it was local conflicts between the original principalities. And it went on that way, kind of like feudal Europe for a very long time. And then we got invasions. From Central Asia. And some of these were undoubtedly Huns, pretty familiar with, but others that we don't really know much of anything about. But Central Asian nomadic raiders entered India, took pieces of it, plundered other parts of it, and made life in much of India rather unhappy. And that went on from between the 11th and the 16th centuries of the Common Era of our era. These invaders did some buildings. They were often influenced by Indian culture once they got there, and became increasingly civilized, increasingly peaceful, and actually built and behaved constructively. But they began as invaders. And that continued until in the 16th century we got Mughal rule. And this went from dates I put down here are 1526 to 1857. And Mughal comes from Mongol. Mongolian Muslims came into India and eventually dominated the entire subcontinent of India, almost all subcontinent of India. And this was an interesting time. Anybody who has been to India would have seen a lot of Mughal constructions there. Mughal art became very, very great art, and undoubtedly the best known example of Mughal art is the Taj Mahal. The Mughals built that. The Mughals were Muslims, but they were quite friendly and tolerant Muslims. So Islam and Hinduism got along quite well during this time. A lot of construction went on during this time. Political rule was pretty gentle and constructive during most of this time. It was, not a bad time. Those, at least the first two of those 3 centuries, under the Mughals. In 1857, the British empowered the British East India Company to set up trading positions in India by force. So this was a Victorian policy. Go, you're not Britain, you're just a private company, but Britain is behind you. So go in and take over, and they took over more and more and more and more. And so in 1858, the British Raj began. Raj meaning R-E-J. The British Raj began the year after that, 1858, and ended in 1947. And I can still remember when I was a kid. I was 1947. I was 15. So I remember the Queen of England always being cited as Empress of India. All the things that she was, Queen of England, Queen of Scotland, Wales, and Empress of India. And that was what the Raj set up, and generally made India part of the British Empire, which then extended itself even further And that was the part of the British Empire on which the sun never set. The idea being it went around the whole world, if you include Canada as well. And then in 1947, Gandhi, a Hindu lawyer who had experienced apartheid in South Africa and developed a certain methodology in South Africa, returned to India and led a non-violent rebellion, which ultimately overthrew the British Raj. It's certainly one of the kind of unbelievable political accomplishments in all of history. No one expected him to succeed. I mean, even in India, people who liked him didn't. The British certainly were totally contemptuous of his efforts. And Churchill, when asked about whether Gandhi represented any threat to the future of the empire, said, "I did not become Her Majesty's first minister to yield the empire to a half-naked fakir." Wonderfully, when the independence was given, it was handed over by Churchill to Gandhi. Nothing was said about the half-naked fakir then, but he attended the ceremony in his typical little waistcloth, things like that. And subsequently, we have India. And then what I think many people now regard as a tragedy, I certainly do, the division of India from Pakistan. It was what Gandhi most feared, and it happened. Jinnah, the main political leader of the Muslims in India, decided that the future of Muslims in India would be imperiled if the British pulled out and rule was entirely in Indian hands. Gandhi insisted that already in the Congress there was a fair representation of Muslims and Hindus, and it would go on that way, but Jinnah didn't believe him, and he persuaded others that they would be a disempowered minority if they remained in India. And that led to the separation of Pakistan from India, Pakistan then being what we now call Pakistan and what we call Bangladesh. Bangladesh was originally part of Pakistan. So the two kind of upper corners of India. And that meant moving enormous numbers of Muslims out of India into Pakistan and moving enormous numbers of Hindus from Pakistan down into India. And it was a terrible refugee crisis. People left everything behind. There was, of course, violence along the way. There was, much death and destruction along the way. But out of this, Pakistan did emerge, and Pakistan's history has not been terribly encouraging in general.
What year was
What?
that? What year? That was like
Same year.
1947.
Yeah, 47.
And who was that Muslim in Pakistan? What was his name?
Jinnah, Jinnah.
Jinnah.
Nehru in India and Jinnah in Pakistan. There is a film about it, a film called Jinnah, which gives a pretty good account of the whole thing. It's not popular. I happen to notice it on, I think, Turner Classic Movies or something like that, something that shows old films. But it's a good film rendition of the whole transition. But Gandhi was, of course, absolutely heartbroken. He finally got where the country ought to be. He was a friend of Jinnah's and tried desperately to persuade him not to do this, but failed. Not long after that, Gandhi was himself assassinated by a fellow Hindu. Interesting remembering the Hindu gods and how God is kind of subsumed under all these separate mythological figures. The last words Gandhi said after he was shot was, "O Salam Ram," using the Arabic word for peace and the Hindu god Ram. Rama Krishna. The Ramayana was, of course, the great epic, and so Ram was a typical popular way of referring to God. So that's the way it went afterwards. And throughout all of this, Hinduism more than survived. Hinduism thrived. And it thrived also during the period of Muslim rule, which again gave Gandhi every hope, you know, when the Muslims and the Hindus got along fine during this time. Why can't we keep on doing that? But that's the way it wound up. Now, during that time, Buddhism increasingly disappeared from India. There are a number of reasons for that. One was internal deterioration of what you might call moral fiber in the monastic communities. The same thing happened in monastic Buddhism, that happened in monastic Christianity in Europe. You know, if you read medieval English literature, there's all this mockery of the monks, you know, all these kind of phonies who are just kind of living off other people. The monks were greatly esteemed by the people, and the people expressed their esteem for the monks by giving them more and more and building them more and more magnificent monasteries, and many of them were magnificent, and arranging for the local farmers to provide for them and so on. So increasingly they became like feudal lords, and their own moral lives deteriorated in the process. There were all kinds of sex scandals, exactly like in medieval Christian monasticism, where there was always a reform movement because things had gotten so bad somewhere. When the invaders came in, therefore, the monks, the monasteries that they encountered, were no longer loved by the people. And they certainly were not loved by the invaders, and they were increasingly destroyed by the invaders. The Muslims, the Buddhists, therefore, spread in various directions. And mostly they went, the greatest number went east through Central Asia into the Far East, became very, very prominent in Southeast Asia, in China, in Korea, and in Japan, where they still are thriving. They also went north, up into the Himalayas, in what is now Nepal and beyond Nepal, to found a new kind of Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, that we'll see just a little bit later. And then some of them went all the way south to what was then Ceylon, what is now Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka is a Buddhist territory. Now the Buddhists that moved, however, were Buddhists of two broadly different kinds, and that's the next thing we want to talk about. During the first centuries of our era, a division took place within Buddhism, which had been kind of in the making for a long time, but it became definitive during this time. And it gave rise to two kinds of Buddhists. The kind that we've been talking about, the traditional, Gautama kind of Buddhists, were referred to by the others as Hinayana. Yana is a raft. It's something to cross rivers on. Oh. Hina means a little, nano.
Little raft?
It's a little raft. Now these are their critics saying that it's just too small. It doesn't make room for enough kinds of people. It's so monastic and limiting and so on. What we are developing is Mahayana. Maha, remember you see Maha so much, it means big, major. Big raft. Big raft. Lots of room on our raft. And that is kind of the way it developed. Hinayana, those whom they call Hinayana, do not like to be called that. I mean, that's an insulting term. they call themselves Theravada. And Theravada means the original, authentic, genuine Buddhism. Whereas Mahayana continues to be Mahayana. Now Mahayana, as history has gone on, has spawned all kinds of Buddhists. Buddhists that seem really, really weird to most of us. There's a kind of Buddhist that thinks simply repeating as often as possible the name of one of their holy people will bring you to nirvana. And so they just go around saying this as much as they can. But it also gave rise to much more wholesome kinds of Buddhism. The big new theological factor that Mahayana brought in was a figure called the Bodhisattva. Bodhi is a Buddha, or an awakened one. Sattva, actually these are close to, these are Indo-European roots. Va, going, sat, to be. Going to be a Buddha, on the way to Buddhahood. So a Bodhisattva was understood as someone who qualified spiritually for nirvana, but instead of reaching nirvana and then just kind of settling into a meditative life until death, in which case when full enlightenment would be achieved, rather took up the cause of others. The Bodhisattva was one, therefore, who postponed his experience of nirvana in order to serve others. The word nirvana, by the way, means going out in the sense that a light goes out, going out like extinction. And it means all your other experiences, the irrelevant, trivial experiences, go out and you're left just with the heart of the matter. Postpone your nirvana and serve others. Serve others in all kinds of ways, but especially spiritually by teaching Buddhism, by facilitating others taking up the same way of life. Some of Thailand and a little bit of Vietnam. If you want to see the other kind, Mahayana, the rest of Vietnam, and then Japan and China and the Far East, Korea. And to the extent that there's Buddhism in India, it tends to be Mahayana, but mostly Buddhism has just been absorbed into Hinduism in India. I mean, people don't really make the distinction much. There's all kinds of Buddhist stuff in Hinduism. But as I mentioned before, Hinduism is like a religious sponge. It can take in everything. It finds a way of fitting it in, and that's been true of pretty much all the Buddhist stuff. The Buddha himself, Gautama, is one of the avatars of a god. So he's in there. He's in Hinduism, and he's in there with a kind of divine status, but without it being regarded as the foundation of a separate religion, separate school of thought, or anything of the kind. With the original idea of the Bodhisattva, postponing nirvana and serving others, you get a very rich ethical literature. A literature about, kind of loving your neighbor as yourself and behaving that way and trying to make life better for others and postponing your own, not only your own enlightenment, but your own satisfaction through doing for others. A very altruistic kind of thing. But as it goes in this direction, that tends to disappear, and the service of the Bodhisattva becomes more and more magical. You invoke the Bodhisattva, and all kinds of good things will happen. There are formulae, kind of charms and incantations that can be used to make the Bodhisattva do good stuff for us. And it's not all that different from Christian saints. Christian saints are proposed as models of heroic charity and so forth. But saints have also invoked and asked to find lost objects and prevent car collisions, and things like that. So it's quite similar to that. But it goes increasingly in the direction of, I would say, the kind of magical bodhisattvas. And that's what leads you finally to some bodhisattvas, as I mentioned before, you just invoke their name over and over and over and over. And if you do that enough, all kinds of wonderful things will happen. Yeah.
Are the bodhisattvas, are they alive? Are these people alive?
Do we know there are any around right now?
I mean, no, normally when you say they invoke their name, they're like saints. Most of the saints are dead.
Yeah, these would be dead also.
These would be dead also.
Yeah.
Okay.
But of course not as quite as dead as our saints.
Not as dead.
Because they're in nirvana. So it's Mahayana is a big raft, and that big raft has room for everything. And I think by our standards, some of it is very inspiring and noble and beautiful, and some of it is stark crazy. And then there are in between things and things that can look crazy till you look at them a little more closely, and then you find more there. Now, probably the Mahayana extreme development that's most familiar to us is the one that took place gradually, moving from India to China to Japan, and we know as Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism is very, very different from the Buddhism we've been looking at. And let's just take a little bit of a look at that. Now, Zen is one of the many offspring of Mahayana. There are countless. In India and in Sanskrit, the term dhyana means meditative. And when Buddhism was described as dhyana, it meant that its emphasis was on meditation. If it was distinguished from other Buddhisms, it meant that the emphasis on meditation was kind of all-absorbing. That's what it is all about. So that's in India. And as Buddhism exited India and moved into China, which was the next big stop, the Chinese rendering of dhyana was Chan. And we had Chan Buddhism in China, but it's the same thing, it's meditative Buddhism. And then as moved from China to Japan, the Japanese tried to say Chan, and it came out Zen. So again, it's the same thing. So it originates in India, but it moves steadily eastward, and it becomes more I would say eccentric all the time. Here it's just kind of, regular old Buddhist exercise with a big stress on meditation. By the time you get to Japanese Zen, meditation is everything, and all kinds of new techniques have been developed in order to maximize your meditative capacity. And that gives rise to a lot of things that people associate with Zen Buddhism as kind of strange. Zen Buddhism wants to get rid of everything except deep meditation. Well, what gets in the way of deep meditation? Obviously, one's passions, one's feelings, things like that, and also one's thoughts. So you got to get rid of all of that. First of all, you got to get rid of the passions and all. And This leads to many things, but I'm just going to focus on some of the stranger ones, but they make sense within their own framework. Make emotions inappropriate. And that leads to, for example, the behavior of a Zen teacher who comes into the group looking very sad. He stands there, his talk hasn't even begun, he's just looking down, and he says, my little son and my 2 little daughters were struck by an omnibus on the highway and killed instantly. And everyone feels terrible about this. And your reaction is the right reaction. What the hell is going on? And that's what he's trying to convey. What the hell is going on here? The emotion is inappropriate. Don't trust your emotions. May be totally different from what you thought. Similarly with kind of ordinary, sort of civilized responses. Zen master may open the door for you, and as you go through it, slam it in your face. Again, all your conventional expectations are lost in this crazy world that you've now entered. Lots and lots of things like that. Zen teachers will come up to a student and say, you're doing very well, aren't you? And then slap you across the face. So again, now, when you go into that, you know what you're getting into, but nevertheless, the experience is different from the theory. And it's, some psychologists have likened it to brainwashing techniques, and I think that's quite accurate. Kind of shock system, and we have it in shock therapy too. Shock systems that have the effect of making habitual responses slow down and maybe vanish and open you up to a different kind of response. I think psychologically that is the category it belongs in. The consequences of shock on cognition and emotion. And remember, brainwashing began with perfectly innocent experiments by Pavlov himself, the old stimulus response guy, who found something strange about dogs in his laboratory in St. Petersburg. The dogs had been, do you know this, George?
Was this Pavlov you talking
This
about?
is Pavlov, yeah. You know about the dogs?
The bell and the slob.
Yeah, and the dogs that he was treating, training, to salivate at the sound of a bell and things like that, were all in nice little kennels in St. Petersburg, and he had to go to Moscow for a lecture or something. And while he was there was a flood in St. Petersburg. And he rushed up as soon as he could get back, and he found that the flood had entered his laboratories and his kennels, and his experimental dogs were swimming in their kennels with their noses pressed up against the roof of the house, all practically dying, trying to breathe. And he got them, rescued them immediately. But how stressed out can you get? And then, everything was tidied up, and he started the experiments again, and everything was gone. All the conditioning of these dogs wasn't there anymore. And then he started to recondition them, and he found that he conditioned them for other things, new conditioning, and he found it went much faster than before. So they were both erased, had both their old responses deleted, and there was a strange receptivity to new conditioning. That became, Pavlov was perfectly innocent in all of this. And he made a note of it, sent in a paper, and didn't do anything more with it. But later on, it became very basic to early research in brainwashing, because that's what you do. You shock people in all kinds of ways, humiliate them, rough them up, scare them, and thereby erase their traditional responses and open the way to, then you come in and be very nice. Say we're offering you a brave new world and so on. So I think it's right that the Zen techniques are precisely that. They're kind of gentle and kind of amusing shock techniques, but they're trying to get rid of stuff and make you open to something, and the something is just plain meditation. Yeah, not going to get a new doctrine or anything like that. So that's the way the process goes, and it leads also to the Zen koans. We got to get rid of we got to keep you from thinking, or thinking the thinking is any good. It's a lot of politicians do that. And so all these little questions are introduced. The one that's most often cited is, tell me the sound of one hand's clapping. One hand doesn't clap. So there are all kinds of unanswerable questions. You think hard now. Don't give up. And you could think about it all day and nothing's going to happen. This is to kind of humiliate your cognitive powers, to trivialize them. Aim them at something unworthy of them, something ridiculous. What we're trying to do is just get them out of the way. So having gotten rid of your emotional responses, or minimize them, and gotten rid of your intellectual responses, you now have a house kind of cleaned up and ready for meditation. And the program proceeds that way. And your meditative techniques are used. You sit in lotus posture, you train your breathing, all the things that ordinary yogas do, but much more intensely. And some people enter these programs for remarkable lengths of time. And there are many very satisfied customers. Many people did this and say, my life is a lot happier now than it was before. Meditation does that. Meditation is good for everybody. And this is a way to meditation, a funny way, a kind of wild way. But I think the benefit that people experience is the benefit that everyone who meditates seriously experiences to some degree. It's calming, it's kind of up-cheering. And as I say, if Zen were just a crazy fraud, we would not have centuries and centuries of satisfied customers coming from their Zen teachers. So it's one kind of Mahayana Buddhism. It's the kind that caught on very big in Japan, and then was exported to the United States and Europe, and is there's some kind of Zen school almost in every big city in the Western world now. And again, you notice in one way, we're kind of back to Gautama because there's no religion about this at all. This is not, we're not getting God to help us or anything like that. It's simply a technique. The survival of Buddhism in China has been interesting because Buddhism survived the Cultural Revolution, survived the whole, elimination of religion in communist China. And it did so by kind of going underground, not totally underground, they didn't pretend they weren't there, but they got very quiet and did their stuff as a kind of like a mental health thing. And the Chinese are okay with that. The Chinese have been, their elimination of religion has always been sort of half-hearted because they always suspected that they could put religion to their own uses. This is applies to Confucianism rather than to Buddhism, but it's an example. I was in, a long time ago, when everybody was still on bicycles and there were no cars, I was in China, and I went to Xi'an, and I went out by myself just to take a walk around Xi'an one day. I had seen the underground statues and all of that. And among other places I stopped was the zoo, the local zoo. And in the Chinese zoo, what do you go look at? The pandas. So there I was looking at the pandas. And this guy came up to me and said to me in English, "Are you English speaking?" And I said, "Yes, it's my native tongue." And he said, "Well, I am an English teacher here in Xi'an, and I almost never have an opportunity to talk to anyone whose native language is English. So he said, if you're just taking a walk, I'm just taking a walk too. Shall we walk around the zoo and you talk?" So we did. He told me about the Chinese names for things and things like that. And then we became rather friendly, and he said, I'd like you to come and visit my family and come and have dinner with us. I said, "Well," he said, "tonight." I said, "Yeah, that'd be cool." So he told me how to get there. No, he came and got me on a bicycle with another bicycle. And so we bicycled to his house, and he took me into it's a large apartment, but there were 4 generations of his family there.
Wow.
You know, from little kids to very old people, everything in between. Now, the apartment was big enough, you know, it wasn't painfully crowded, but there was a lot of people there. And they were all deferring to one very old gentleman. I could kind of see that. And he took me over. He said, "First of all, I want you to meet my grandfather, who was a leading scholar in China. And I think he would like to talk to you." I said, "Great." So, you know, he translated for us. Grandpa didn't speak English. And he told me about his academic life. He had been a professor of philosophy at the University of Xi'an, with an emphasis in Confucianism. And the Cultural Revolution came, and he, of course, didn't like it. And he was teaching his class one day when the door opened, and several military came in and came up to the front. And he said the first thing they did was to take my eyeglasses off my face, throw them on the floor, and stamp on them. And then they said, "You come with us." And he said, I went with them. They put me in a military vehicle, and I did not see anyone in my family for the next 20 years.
Good Lord.
They took me to the far south of China and made me a peasant working in the rice paddies. For all this time, the family couldn't get any information about it at all. You know, the students just saw him go. And he said, after these many years, I was out in the rice paddy one day. A military vehicle pulls up beside the rice paddy. They call to somebody who calls to somebody who calls to me and said, "Go to the vehicle." So I went to the vehicle, and they said, "Get in." He said, "Well, I guess now they're going to kill me." And so they were, you know, killing intellectuals for a while. So they took him into the nearest town and got him a nice suit, nice shoes, dressed him up. And he said, "Where am I going now?" He said, "You're going back to your family in Xi'an." They took him back, and he was reunited with his family. And I said, "Well, what are you doing now?" He said, "I am professor of philosophy at the university."
So what is that?
The explanation of it was that they had, the government had come to the conclusion that these people could be useful, that their teaching actually could be made to serve their purposes. And so don't stick them in the rice paddies, don't kill them, put them in there and try to line up, you know, Marxist doctrine with their teaching and so on. And he benefited by that. But he said, you know, a quarter of my life was spent down there in the rice paddy, and you know, he looked so hearty, and he was old, very hearty and healthy and happy. And they did that also with, you know, many other representatives of religion. You know, first of all, stamp them all out, then second thoughts. They might be handy. Let's try them. So in China, you have Lamaism, as they call it there. They don't like that because the Lamas are Tibetan Buddhists, and the ones in China are not Tibetan Buddhists. But in China, the official name for them is Lamaism. Now, about Tibetan Buddhists. As we said, there was a big exodus of Buddhists from India, caused partly by the invaders and partly by other factors. And one of the places they went was up to the Himalayas. Refugees like mountains everywhere because that's where you're least likely to be chased. All over the world there are people called, montagnards or something like that. And you look into their history and you find the reason they're there is because they were fleeing something several generations ago and they didn't come this far up the mountain. So we were okay here and we stayed afterwards. So that was part of their view of the Buddhists. We'll go up there and they're not going to bother us there. They went up there and found a very, very primitive culture and adapted Buddhism to it in a very, very radical way. So Tibetan Buddhism, if you see it in its folksiest form, doesn't really look like Buddhism at all. The gathering place of the Sangha, remember the Sangha is the Buddhist community, and I said very early they began kind of gathering around the burial places of all Buddhists. And originally it was just a burial mound like that, called a stupa. Just a little burial mound here about ancients. And often this kind of Buddhism is called Tantric Buddhism, because these formulae, you just say them or shout them or sing them, and they make good things happen, or they prevent bad things happening. So they're charms, really.
Yeah, magic words.
Yeah, exactly. And that tends to be what that Buddhism is about. It seems to work for the people. I mean, you can see the people are, happier when they've done their thing on the stupa and spun their prayer wheel than they were before. But by most of the other world standards, it's just crude superstition. Now, Tibetan Buddhism, remember, was originally managed by the Dalai Lama, who lived in a great palace by a great temple in Tibet, but he can't go there anymore. And the Dalai Lama, who is now traveling around, is trying to kind of civilize Tibetan Buddhism, to eliminate the superstition, keep the devotion, and restore a more traditionally Buddhist quality to it. But since he can't do it in Tibet, he has to do it wherever he goes, and he goes to Buddhist settlements elsewhere. That's about the way that has gone. It's a very, very different kind of Buddhism. It's famous for its food, among other things. Tibetan Buddhists have a tremendous range of very delicious foods. Most very natural foods, vegetarian foods. They're really good. And now there are restaurants opening around our country where Tibetan cuisine is what's featured. It's that strange, the globalization of all this stuff. So those are the main kinds of Buddhism we've got now. The Buddhism in China, Japan, is very closely linked with the traditional religions of China and Japan. And since we're going to China next week, there's a picture that you see all over the place in religious precincts in China of these three old guys with their arms over one another's shoulders, looking very kind of wise and nice. They are Confucius, the founder of Taoism, who's Lao Tzu, and the Buddha. Now they live centuries apart, but this representation is that they're all united here. Are we Buddhists? Well, yeah. Are you Confucius? Yeah. Are you Taoist? Yeah. They all fit together. All of these. So, okay, we'll go on to Confucianism next time. You've all got Confucianism notes in.
Thank you.